I don't know about all of you guys, but I actively seek out vintage games I've never played before all the time. And what I've discovered by doing so in the last 5, 6, 7 years, something like that, is that I actually don't think a lot of vintage games have aged poorly. And it's not just nostalgia, because many of them I'm playing for the first time. And I think this is very interesting that this is the opinion I come to after actually playing a lot of vintage games. And I think a lot of the people who say old games have aged poorly just haven't played a lot of them or aren't interested in trying to learn how to play the game that they're playing. I think the big thing that makes a lot of people say that a vintage game is aged or feels as has aged poorly has to do with the fact that there's a certain literacy in terms of playing vintage games that is not immediately gonna work all the time for a lot of people. If you grew up playing things like during the seventh generation where everything was handed to you on a platter, or even now it's kind of like that too, then games that actively ask you to come to them on their terms and play the way that they are designed with a control scheme or an ideology that does not line up perfectly one to one with the modern design philosophy of the gaming industry of today, then yeah, I could see how you would think that it would be aged. That's not really the way I would describe it. I've got a perfect analogy for this. You would never say Frankenstein, Dracula, or Pride and Prejudice require nostalgia to be good. They are just literary greats, plain and simple, and vintage games are just like that. You know what the big challenge for trying to read something like Frankenstein or Pride and Prejudice is for somebody who's only read modern books? It's a literacy issue. It's an issue of trying to understand the language of the literature. And just like that, vintage games require you to understand the language of the design in order to enjoy them. Now, that being said, you might come across something that is considered one of the greatest games of all time, like Final Fantasy VII, and not like it because you don't like the art direction and style, because the look of Final Fantasy VII was very much intentional. They could have made it look more graphically impressive at the time. It could have looked closer to Final Fantasy VIII, for instance, but they chose not to. They chose to go with this more chibi style because it was kind of their marriage of the theater vibe that they were going for with classic Final Fantasy. And they were very scared that they were going to lose their classic audience if they went way too far into the realm of realism and grittiness. So Final Fantasy VII is very intentionally designed in terms of its art direction and the graphics that they had available. But if you don't like that, that's a taste thing, right? Some people don't like Lord of the Rings because they don't like the way it's written. I'm not one of those people. I love Lord of the Rings, but there are people like that, and they want to stick to the movie because it's a little bit more easily digestible. It doesn't require any effort to digest, right? And that's how I feel about a lot of modern games. They're really designed to be consumable. That's what they are. They're consumption products versus the art that we had before. And I've got a couple examples of games I want to talk about today to explain the effect that I have and why I don't think vintage games have actually aged that poorly at all. The first one I want to talk about is Tomb Raider, specifically for controls. Now, for a long time, Tomb Raider was considered as having bad controls, even when I was younger. Even at the turn of the 2000s, when control schemes are starting to become more standardized, following Halo and early Call of Duty and stuff like that, even back then within that context, myself and other people playing Tomb Raider thought the controls were kind of rough. And that's because they're not intuitive. I don't think it has anything to do with the design methodology of the creators, because they were trying to design a really fun and good game. It's just that they were designing it along, at the same time Super Mario 64 was coming out, so there wasn't a genuine standard. And then once they made Tomb Raider 1, they had to keep going with that control scheme because it was the engine that they had and it's what worked for the engine. But I would argue it's not bad for a game to take some learning to appreciate. Not everything needs to be something that you pick up, understand immediately the control scheme of, and then play. I actually really enjoyed playing Tomb Raider recently and trying to figure out what the controls were and trying to play more fluidly. I thought that was a lot of fun. And honestly, it really did quite remind me of the first time I read Frankenstein and I had to sit here, paragraph after paragraph, and think, what the heck is happening right now? What is this guy saying? And Frankenstein is one of my favorite books these days. You know, that wasn't, I was in high school when that happened, but it's one of my favorite books these days, and I think there's a real beauty of language and design in Frankenstein. Just like I'm really starting to appreciate Tomb Raider for that same reason. And it's not the first vintage game that I've played in my adult life for the first time where I've kind of felt this way. The original Resident Evil is one of those. I really do feel like the original Resident Evil is designed really beautifully. And I mean, I also agree with everybody else that Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis are better. But the point I'm making is that this classic style of tank control, pre-rendered background Resident Evil games were really good. And they're a lot of fun. And honestly, I remember thinking when I was growing up that the controls were hard to understand. But then when I sat there and I thought harder about that, I felt like that was a little bit of a regurgitation of what I was hearing other people say. Because when I played it, I got it right away. I didn't find it hard at all. And it was the PS1 version. It wasn't the PS5 version either. It was the PS1 original version, and I did not think it was that hard to comprehend how movement worked and things like that. And I think it really was just a lot of people that had a preconceived notion of how games should control, and then they're not ready for anything to control differently. This also kind of goes into Armored Core 1, which did get released on PS5 just this year, and it plays classically. You know, you move around with you have to use your bumper buttons to move the direction of the reticle and stuff like that. And you know, if it were a first-person shooter, that would be really, really rough. I played a first-person shooter like that, like Quake 2 on PS1, for instance, but it's not. It's supposed to facilitate the idea that you are a mech and that you are controlling by pushing levers and stuff. And I think it communicates that quite well. And then also, it punishes you then for picking a very tiny reticle, because you can pick your whole screen as a reticle, and so that it really rewards and facilitates your design as a mech operator, and I really enjoy it for that reason. Now that's controls, right? And controls, like anything else, are going to be up to preference. If you cannot stand this stuff and you just need something designed the way that's going to match your muscle memory, then a lot of these games are not going to work for you. They just won't. And I think that's okay. I think it's perfectly fine to have games that are not going to be appreciated by everyone. I think it actually makes them better. I feel like when I come across somebody who actually does like these games and I watch their video on YouTube or something, it's like they get it, man. And they're not out here saying controls are bad or this is bad, which I think is often coming from a place of somebody who just didn't want to take the time to try and learn it, to slow down a second and return to their childhood roots and be like, okay, I don't know how to play games anymore. How do I play this one? Instead of just getting it right away. And then the other thing I want to talk about today is PS1 era graphics and art direction, and pre-rendered backgrounds. I think pre-rendered backgrounds are absolutely gorgeous. They are wonderful, and I would love to see more of them in the gaming industry, and we basically don't get them at all anymore, but I would love to see them again. And I really do like the way PS1 games look, like Crash and Spyro and Final Fantasy IX, for instance. I think all of these games look really, really good. And it's really just an art style, man. And if you don't like the art style, just like if you didn't like the Romantic era or the Baroque era or the Abstract era or whatever era exists, if you don't like that, then you don't like that. But I don't think it's that it's aged poorly. I just think that you don't like it. That's just what it is. And that would be the more accurate way to say it, because to be honest with you, if it had aged so poorly, we wouldn't be getting a lot of indie games that are starting to rep that late 90s, early 3D look and feel. And I can't speak for everybody, but I love it. I love seeing it in the boomer shooter space. I love seeing it in the survival horror space. I hope I get to see it within the JRPG space soon, that somebody starts actually trying to make PS1 era Final Fantasy in the indie sphere again. That would be sick. And the only thing that I'm more hyped for than that is somebody trying to go for a PS2 era look, which no indie game that I know of at least has ever successfully accomplished doing. And that's because those games were made with a very specific engine, and that's why they all kind of look a certain way. And personally, that one might be, this one might be nostalgia just because I grew up a lot on the PS2. But I personally really, really like that PS2 graphics and art direction. I love it so much, and I would love to have some more indie games that look like that. I think we're at the point now where maybe it's time to let the NES and SNES indie sphere go and maybe try to do some more PS1 and 64, Dreamcast, PS2, and Xbox looking games. That's what I think anyway. So yeah, at the end of the day, guys, I don't think most vintage games have actually aged poorly. I think they've aged just fine. And it's just a perspective thing. So no, it's not just nostalgia, and I think anyone who's like, you're just nostalgic for this game, even though you just played it for the first time this year, is just trying to deflect any valid thing that you can say in favor of vintage video games, which I think have gone through a very unfair period of being smeared by a lot of people who are not giving them the fair shot that they deserve. So guys, I want to throw it back to you now. What do you guys think about this vintage games of all aged poorly thing that I hear people say all the time? Let's chat about it in the comments below, and while you're down there, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. I make new gaming videos every single Wednesday and Friday, and if you like this video, you will probably like my other and future work. If you have a moment right now, consider checking out one of the videos on the screen. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games. I very much appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great day.